As a criminal profiler who has spent 3 decades analyzing the most perplexing murder cases in American history, I can tell you that some crimes transcend their era and become psychological puzzles that challenge everything we think we know about human nature. The Hall Mills murder case of 1922 is one such enigma. After years of studying the evidence, the behavioral patterns, and the complex web of relationships involved, I believe I've uncovered new insights that previous investigators missed. My name is Dr. Michael Harrison, and I've made it my life's work to understand the criminal mind. I've profiled serial killers, analyzed mass murderers, and studied crimes of passion from every conceivable angle. But the double murder that shocked New Brunswick, New Jersey over a century ago continues to fascinate me in ways that few cases have. What you're about to hear is the result of extensive research, psychological analysis, and a fresh perspective on evidence that was either overlooked or misunderstood by investigators of that time. On the morning of September 16, 1922, 2 bodies were discovered beneath a crabapple tree on Phillips Farm in Franklin Township, just outside New Brunswick. The victims were Reverend Edward Hall, a 41-year-old Episcopal minister, and Eleanor Mills, a 34-year-old choir singer from his church. But this wasn't just a double homicide. The staging of the crime scene revealed a killer with a very specific psychological profile, someone who wanted to send a message that went far beyond simple murder. The bodies were positioned with deliberate precision. Both victims lay on their backs, their feet pointing toward the crabapple tree. Hall's right hand rested on Mills's neck, while her left hand touched his knee. Between them, scattered like confetti of betrayal, were torn pieces of love letters the couple had exchanged. Hall's business card was propped against his left foot, almost like a signature on a macabre piece of artwork. This wasn't the work of a common criminal, or even a crime of sudden passion. This was a psychological signature of someone who felt deeply wronged and wanted the world to know why these 2 people had to die. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, the killer demonstrated several key characteristics that modern profiling techniques can now identify with remarkable accuracy. First, the careful staging suggests someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's relationship. Second, the symbolic placement of the love letters indicates a perpetrator who felt betrayed by the affair and wanted to expose it publicly, even in death. Third, the precision of the scene composition reveals someone who had time to plan and execute their vision without fear of immediate discovery. Edward Hall had been shot once through the head with a .32 caliber revolver. The bullet entered near his right ear and exited through his left temple, suggesting the killer stood close, possibly face to face with his victim. Eleanor Mills suffered a more brutal fate. She was shot 3 times in the face, and her throat was slashed from ear to ear, with what investigators believed was a very sharp knife or razor. The escalation in violence between the 2 murders tells us something crucial about the killer's psychological state and their feelings toward each victim. The differential treatment of the victims is particularly revealing from a psychological standpoint. Hall's single, relatively clean execution-style wound suggests the killer viewed him as the primary target, but didn't harbor the same level of personal animosity toward him. Mills's multiple gunshot wounds and the additional throat slashing indicates a much deeper, more personal rage. This pattern often emerges in cases where the perpetrator sees one victim as the instigator of their pain and the other as equally guilty of betrayal. What makes this case even more psychologically complex is the social context of 1922 America. The country was emerging from World War I, experiencing the social upheaval of the Roaring '20s, and grappling with changing moral standards. A scandal involving a married Episcopal minister and a married choir singer would have been particularly shocking in a small, tight-knit community like New Brunswick. The killer understood this social dynamic and exploited it by staging the crime scene to maximize public outrage and humiliation. The investigation that followed was hampered by techniques that we now know were woefully inadequate for a crime of this complexity. The crime scene was contaminated by curious onlookers, evidence was mishandled, and investigators lacked the psychological profiling tools that could have provided crucial insights into the perpetrator's mindset. But even with these limitations, certain facts emerged that modern analysis can now interpret with greater accuracy. The affair between Hall and Mills had been ongoing for several years, according to the love letters found at the scene. These weren't casual encounters, but a deep emotional relationship that both participants took very seriously. Hall, despite being married to Frances Hall, a member of the wealthy Johnson & Johnson pharmaceutical family, was genuinely in love with Mills. The letters reveal plans for them to run away together, suggesting that Hall was considering leaving his wife and his position at the church to start a new life with Mills. This revelation provides crucial insight into the motive. Someone close to one or both victims knew about these plans and couldn't allow them to come to fruition. The question that has puzzled investigators for over a century is, who had the most to lose if Hall and Mills had successfully disappeared together? Frances Hall, the minister's wife, immediately emerged as the primary suspect. From a psychological profile standpoint, she had every classic motive for murder. Her husband was planning to abandon her for another woman, which would have meant not only personal humiliation, but potentially significant financial consequences. In 1922, divorce laws heavily favored men, and Frances could have found herself cut off from her husband's income and potentially her own family's wealth if the scandal became too great. But Frances Hall wasn't an ordinary scorned wife. She came from the Stevens family, who had built a pharmaceutical empire that would later become Johnson & Johnson. She had resources, connections, and access to people who could help her solve her problem permanently. More importantly, she had two brothers who were deeply devoted to her and would have done anything to protect the family name and fortune. Henry Stevens was an accomplished marksman and outdoorsman, who certainly had the skills to carry out the murders with the precision demonstrated at the crime scene. Willie Stevens, who was developmentally disabled but fiercely loyal to his sister, could have served as either an accomplice or an unwitting participant in the crime. The three siblings lived together in the Hall family home, creating a tight-knit unit with shared interests in protecting their collective reputation and wealth. However, after analyzing hundreds of similar cases involving family conspiracies, I've identified several behavioral patterns that don't quite fit the expected profile if Frances Hall and her brothers were the perpetrators. The extreme brutality shown toward Eleanor Mills suggests a level of personal hatred that goes beyond what we typically see in cases where a wife eliminates her husband's mistress. The killer's rage toward Mills was deeply personal, indicating a relationship or interaction that may have predated the affair itself. Let me pause here for a moment because I want to hear from you, our viewers. This case has fascinated people for over a century, and I'm curious about your perspective. What city are you watching from today? I'd love to know where our audience is located and whether you have any local stories or legends about unsolved crimes from the early 20th century. Leave a comment below and tell me your city and whether your area has any similar historical mysteries that still capture people's imagination. The regional differences in how these old cases are remembered and retold often provide valuable insights into the communities where they occurred.
The investigation in 1922 was led by Detective Joseph Stricker, who found himself dealing with a case that was far beyond the typical crimes his department usually handled. Small-town police departments in the 1920s were simply not equipped to handle a case with this level of complexity, media attention, and social prominence of the suspects. The evidence collection was inconsistent, witness interviews were not conducted systematically, and the crime scene was compromised almost immediately by curious onlookers and journalists. From a modern forensic psychology perspective, several crucial pieces of evidence were either overlooked or misinterpreted. The positioning of the bodies, for example, was noted, but not analyzed for its psychological significance. The selective brutality toward Mills was observed, but not properly profiled to understand what it revealed about the killer's relationship with the victims. Most importantly, the social dynamics within the Hall household and the broader New Brunswick community were not fully explored. One aspect of the case that particularly intrigues me as a criminologist is the 4-year gap between the murders and the eventual trial. In 1922, despite intensive investigation and significant public pressure, no arrests were made. The case went cold, and it seemed like the killers had gotten away with perfect murder. But then, in 1926, new evidence surfaced that led to the arrest of Frances Hall and her two brothers. This 4-year delay is actually quite common in complex family conspiracy cases. Often the initial investigation fails because family members protect each other and present a united front to authorities. But over time, the psychological pressure of keeping such a significant secret begins to take its toll. Someone always talks, or evidence emerges that wasn't initially available, or investigators develop new techniques that allow them to re-examine old evidence with fresh eyes. The catalyst for reopening the Hall Mills case was the emergence of a key witness named Jane Gibson, who became known in the press as the Pig Woman because she raised pigs on her property near the crime scene. Gibson claimed that on the night of the murders, she had witnessed the crime while investigating suspicious activity near her farm. Her testimony was dramatic, detailed, and ultimately became the centerpiece of the prosecution's case against Frances Hall and her brothers. From a psychological standpoint, Gibson's account is both fascinating and problematic. She claimed to have hidden behind a cedar tree while watching 4 people argue near the crabapple tree where the bodies were later found. According to her testimony, she recognized Frances Hall's voice during the argument and witnessed the actual shootings. She described seeing a woman with white hair, which matched Frances Hall's appearance, directing 2 men who carried out the murders while a 4th person stood guard. However, Gibson's credibility was severely damaged by several factors that modern witness psychology research would immediately flag as problematic. First, she didn't come forward with her story until 4 years after the crime, claiming she was afraid for her own safety. Second, her account contained specific details that seemed almost too convenient for the prosecution's theory of the case. Third, she had a history of disputes with neighbors and may have had personal motivations for wanting to see the Hall family prosecuted. Most significantly, from a psychological analysis standpoint, Gibson's story contains several elements that are commonly found in false witness testimony. Her claim to have hidden perfectly still for an extended period while watching a murder, her ability to identify voices in the dark from a significant distance, and her remarkably detailed recall of events 4 years after they occurred all raise red flags that modern experts would immediately recognize. The trial that began in November 1926 became a media sensation that dominated headlines across the country. It was called the Trial of the Century, a designation that wouldn't be used again until the Lindbergh kidnapping case a decade later. The courtroom was packed with journalists, photographers, and curiosity seekers who treated the proceedings like entertainment rather than a serious legal matter. The prosecution, led by Special Prosecutor Alexandra Simpson, built their case around the theory that Frances Hall had discovered her husband's plans to leave her for Eleanor Mills and enlisted her brothers to help eliminate the problem permanently. They argued that the 3 siblings had followed Hall and Mills to the regular meeting place and confronted them about the affair. When the couple refused to end their relationship, the confrontation turned violent, resulting in the double murder. The defense, however, presented a very different picture of the events. They argued that Frances Hall was a devoted wife who was unaware of her husband's affair until after his death. They portrayed her as a grieving widow who was being scapegoated because of her family's wealth and social prominence. Most importantly, they systematically dismantled Jane Gibson's credibility as a witness, revealing numerous inconsistencies in her story and questioning her motivations for coming forward. From a behavioral analysis perspective, the courtroom dynamics revealed several interesting psychological patterns. Frances Hall herself presented as a composed, dignified woman who showed appropriate grief when discussing her husband, but never displayed the kind of explosive anger or jealousy that might be expected from someone capable of orchestrating a double murder. Her brother Henry was articulate and confident, showing none of the nervous behavior typically associated with guilty defendants. Willie Stevens, despite his developmental disabilities, was actually the most compelling witness for the defense, displaying a childlike honesty that made it difficult to believe he could be part of a conspiracy. The prosecution's case ultimately fell apart because they couldn't establish a convincing timeline that would have allowed the 3 defendants to carry out the murders and return home without being noticed. Several witnesses testified that Frances Hall was at home during the critical time period, and there was no physical evidence directly linking any of the defendants to the crime scene. After deliberating for less than 5 hours, the jury returned not guilty verdicts for all 3 defendants. The speed of their decision suggested that they found the prosecution's case fundamentally unconvincing, despite the enormous public pressure to find someone guilty of the sensational murders. But here's where the case becomes even more psychologically fascinating from a modern perspective. The acquittal didn't resolve the question of who actually committed the murders. It simply established that the prosecution couldn't prove beyond the reasonable doubt that Frances Hall and her brothers were responsible. The real killer or killers were still out there, and the behavioral evidence from the crime scene suggests that they may have been much closer to the victims than anyone originally suspected. One theory that has never been fully explored involves Eleanor Mills' own husband, James Mills. From a psychological profiling standpoint, he actually fits the perpetrator profile better than Francis Hall. In several key ways, he would have had intimate knowledge of his wife's schedule and habits, making it easy for him to follow her to the meeting with Hall. The extreme violence directed toward Eleanor suggests someone who felt deeply betrayed by her specifically, which would be more consistent with the husband's rage than a rival's jealousy. James Mills also had a compelling motive that went beyond simple jealousy. If his wife had successfully run away with Hall, he would have been left not only alone, but also financially devastated. Eleanor's income from her job at the church and her various music students was crucial to their household economy. Her abandonment would have meant both personal humiliation and financial ruin for James. Moreover, the psychological profile of the crime scene staging suggests someone who wanted to punish the victims for their betrayal while simultaneously exposing their affair to the world. A wronged husband would have exactly this kind of motivation, wanting both revenge and public vindication of his position as the injured party. The behavioral evidence also supports this theory in subtle ways that weren't fully appreciated in 1922. The careful positioning of Hall's business card at his feet could be interpreted as a message specifically about his professional identity as a minister who had betrayed his sacred vows. This kind of symbolic communication is more consistent with someone who felt personally betrayed by Hall's hypocrisy than with someone who simply wanted him dead to solve a practical problem.
James Mills was investigated in 1922, but not with the thoroughness that modern techniques would require. His alibi was verified, but not rigorously tested. His emotional responses were noted, but not psychologically analyzed. Most importantly, his potential access to accomplices, or his ability to have carried out the crime alone, was never fully explored. If you're enjoying this deep dive into one of America's most fascinating unsolved murders, I'd really appreciate it if you take a moment to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Cases like the Hall-Mills murders require extensive research and analysis to present accurately, and your support helps us continue to bring you these detailed explorations of historical true crime mysteries. We've got several other early 20th century cases lined up that I think you'll find equally compelling, including some that have never been properly analyzed using modern psychological profiling techniques. Another suspect who deserves consideration from a modern psychological perspective is someone from within the church community itself. Religious institutions in the 1920s were tight-knit social organizations where everyone knew everyone else's business. The affair between Hall and Mills couldn't have been conducted in complete secrecy, especially if it had been going on for several years, as the love letters suggested. Church members who disapproved of the relationship might have felt justified in taking extreme action to protect the moral integrity of their religious community. This kind of religiously motivated violence has specific psychological characteristics that are actually consistent with some aspects of the Hall-Mills crime scene. The symbolic staging, the public exposure of the affair through the scattered love letters, and the apparent moral judgment implied by the positioning of the bodies all suggest someone who saw themselves as an agent of divine justice rather than simply a murderer. This theory gains additional credibility when we consider the social context of 1920s America. The country was experiencing significant cultural upheaval, with traditional religious and moral values being challenged by the emerging modern lifestyle. Conservative religious communities often felt under siege and may have been more likely to take extreme action to defend their beliefs and institutions. From a geographical profiling standpoint, the location of the murders also provides important clues about the perpetrator's identity and motivations. Phillips Farm was not a random location, but a place that was well known locally as a lover's meeting spot. The killer knew exactly where to find Hall and Mills, suggesting someone with intimate knowledge of their routine and habits. The fact that the bodies were left exposed rather than hidden or buried indicates that the killer wanted them to be found relatively quickly. This is consistent with someone whose primary motivation was to expose the affair and punish the victims publicly, rather than simply eliminate them quietly. A calculating family member trying to solve a practical problem would more likely have made the bodies disappear entirely to avoid the scandal and investigation that discovery would bring.
The forensic evidence, limited as it was by 1920s technology, also provides some interesting insights when analyzed using modern techniques. The ballistics evidence showed that Hall was killed with a single shot from a .32 caliber revolver, while Mills was shot 3 times with the same weapon before having her throat cut. This pattern suggests a killer who was either running out of ammunition or was interrupted during the attack. The throat cutting is particularly significant from a psychological standpoint. This kind of overkill is almost always personal and emotional rather than practical. Someone who simply wanted Mills dead could have accomplished that with the gunshots. The additional violence suggests rage, hatred, or a desire to ensure that she could never speak or sing again. This level of symbolic violence points towards someone who had a very specific grudge against Mills herself, not just against the affair in general. The weapon itself was never found, despite extensive searches of the area around the crime scene. This suggests either that the killer was local enough to dispose of it in a familiar location, or that they had planned carefully enough to bring a disposal method with them. Both possibilities point towards someone with intimate knowledge of the local area and time to plan the crime carefully. One aspect of the case that has always troubled me as a criminologist is the complete lack of physical evidence linking any suspect to the crime scene. In a double murder involving close-range shootings and a knife attack, there should have been blood spatter, gunpowder residue, or other trace evidence on the perpetrator's clothing or person. The fact that no such evidence was ever found suggests either extraordinary luck or careful preparation on the killer's part. This absence of physical evidence actually supports the theory that the murders were planned well in advance, rather than being crimes of sudden passion. Someone who intended to kill Hall and Mills would have had time to plan their approach, choose appropriate clothing that could be easily disposed of, and select a method that would minimize the risk of leaving trace evidence. The love letters found at the crime scene provide another window into the psychological dynamics of the case. These weren't casual notes, but deeply emotional communications that revealed the true depth of the relationship between Hall and Mills. They talked about running away together, starting a new life, and their frustration with having to keep their love secret. For someone reading these letters, the level of commitment and planning involved in the affair would have been shocking and threatening. From a behavioral analysis standpoint, the decision to scatter these letters around the bodies was clearly intentional and symbolic. The killer wanted to ensure that the relationship was exposed in the most dramatic way possible. This suggests someone who felt that the public needed to know about the affair and understand why the murders were justified or necessary. The handwriting analysis of the letters, primitive by today's standards but still useful, confirmed that they were genuine communications between Hall and Mills. This rules out the possibility that they were planted by someone trying to create a false motive for the murders. The affair was real, the emotions were genuine, and the plans to leave their respective spouses were serious. What makes the letters even more psychologically significant is their tone and content. They reveal two people who were genuinely in love, but also deeply frustrated with their situation. Hall, in particular, expressed anger at his wife and his position in the church that prevented him from being with Mills openly. This kind of documented resentment could have provided motivation for several different categories of suspects. As we approach our conclusion, I want to engage you one more time because this case really benefits from crowdsourced thinking. I've presented several different theories about who might have been responsible for the Hall-Mills murders, but I'm curious about your perspective. Which suspect do you find most compelling? Frances Hall protecting her marriage and social position, James Mills responding to his wife's betrayal, a religious zealot punishing moral transgressors, or someone else entirely? Take a moment to leave a comment with your theory and your reasoning. I read every comment and often find insights from viewers that professional investigators might have missed. Your fresh perspective on this century-old mystery could provide the key insight that finally solves the case. The trial of Frances Hall and her brothers in 1926 was ultimately unsatisfactory because it focused on the wrong questions. Instead of trying to understand the psychological dynamics that led to the murders, the prosecution simply tried to prove that the most obvious suspects were guilty. Instead of analyzing the behavioral evidence from the crime scene, they relied primarily on the questionable testimony of a single witness, whose credibility was easily destroyed. Modern criminal profiling techniques would approach this case very differently. We would start with a detailed analysis of the crime scene staging to understand the killer's psychological state and motivations. We would examine the differential treatment of the two victims to understand the killer's relationship with each of them. We would analyze the timing, location, and method of the murders to determine the level of planning involved and the killer's familiarity with the victim's routines. Most importantly, we would look beyond the obvious suspects to consider anyone who had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crimes. This might include people who were never seriously investigated in 1922 because they didn't fit the preconceived notions of who would be likely to commit such a crime. The Hall-Mills case also illustrates the dangers of letting media coverage and public opinion drive criminal investigations. The enormous publicity surrounding the case created pressure to find someone to blame, regardless of whether the evidence actually supported prosecution. The focus on Frances Hall and her brothers may have prevented investigators from pursuing other leads that could have led to the real perpetrators. From a sociological perspective, the case reveals the class tensions and social dynamics of 1920s America. The fact that Frances Hall came from a wealthy, prominent family initially protected her from suspicion, but eventually made her a target when public pressure demanded someone be held accountable. The contrast between the treatment of different suspects based on their social status provides insight into the inequalities of the justice system during that era. The geographic and temporal setting of the murders also contributed to their impact on American culture. New Brunswick in 1922 was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but close enough to New York City to attract national media attention. The case became a symbol of the moral upheaval that many Americans felt was threatening traditional values during the Roaring Twenties. The unsolved nature of the Hall-Mills murders continues to fascinate criminologists and true crime enthusiasts today because it represents a perfect storm of psychological complexity, social dynamics, and investigative limitations. Every theory about the case has strengths and weaknesses, and every suspect has compelling motives along with reasonable alibis. What we can say with confidence is that the murders were committed by someone with intimate knowledge of both victims, access to their routines and meeting places, and strong emotional motivations for wanting them dead. The killer was organized enough to plan the crime carefully, but emotional enough to engage in symbolic staging and excessive violence. They were familiar enough with the local area to dispose of evidence successfully, but careless enough to leave the bodies in a location where they would be quickly discovered. These characteristics could fit several different categories of suspects, which is why the case remains unsolved after more than a century. The behavioral evidence points in multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting that the real killer may have been someone who combined elements from different suspect profiles in ways that investigators didn't anticipate. As we conclude our exploration of this fascinating case, it's worth reflecting on what the Hall-Mills murders tell us about human nature, criminal behavior, and the pursuit of justice. The case demonstrates how passion, betrayal, and social pressure can combine to create explosive situations where ordinary people might be driven to extraordinary violence. It also shows us how the limitations of investigative techniques and social biases can prevent justice from being served. The real perpetrators of the Hall-Mills murders may have escaped punishment not because they were particularly clever, but because the investigation was hampered by inadequate forensic science, media interference, and assumptions about who was likely to commit such crimes. Most importantly, the case reminds us that behind every true crime story are real people whose lives were cut short by violence and families who never received the closure that comes with solving a case and holding perpetrators accountable. Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills may have made choices that others found morally questionable, but they didn't deserve to die for those choices, and their families deserved better from the justice system. The Hall-Mills murders remain one of America's most intriguing unsolved cases because they combine elements of forbidden love, social scandal, family dynamics, and investigative mystery in ways that continue to capture our imagination. While we may never know with certainty who killed the minister and his choir singer beneath that crabapple tree in 1922, the case continues to provide valuable insights into criminal behavior, investigative techniques, and the complex social dynamics that can lead ordinary people to commit extraordinary crimes. If you found this analysis compelling, please consider giving this video a like and sharing it with others who appreciate detailed examinations of historical true crime cases. The algorithms that determine which content gets seen depend heavily on engagement, and your support helps ensure that these in-depth explorations reach the audience that will appreciate them most. We have several other early 20th century mysteries lined up for future episodes, including some cases that have never been properly analyzed using modern psychological profiling techniques. The legacy of the Hall Mills case extends far beyond the specific crime itself. It was one of the first murder cases to receive extensive national media coverage, setting precedents for how sensational crimes would be reported and prosecuted in the modern era. The legal strategies used by both prosecution and defense attorneys influenced courtroom tactics that are still employed today. The forensic techniques that proved inadequate in 1922 led to improvements in evidence collection and analysis that benefited future investigations. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrated the importance of understanding the psychological dimensions of crime. The failure to properly analyze the behavioral evidence from the Hall Mills crime scene contributed to the failure to identify and prosecute the real perpetrators. Modern criminal profiling techniques that might have solved this case in 1922 didn't exist, but they were developed partly in response to the limitations revealed by cases like this one. Today, more than a century after the murders, the crabapple tree where Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were found is long gone, but the questions raised by their deaths continue to challenge our understanding of criminal behavior and human nature. The case stands as a reminder that some mysteries may never be fully solved, but they can still teach us valuable lessons about justice, truth, and the complex motivations that drive people to violence. The Hall Mills murders will likely remain forever unsolved, joining the ranks of historical mysteries that continue to fascinate new generations of amateur detectives and professional criminologists. But perhaps that's fitting for a case that has always been more about the questions it raises than the answers it provides. In the end, the true value of studying cases like this lies not in identifying the perpetrator with certainty, but in understanding the psychological, social, and investigative factors that allow some crimes to remain mysteries despite intensive investigation and public scrutiny. As we close this examination of one of America's most enduring criminal mysteries, remember that the pursuit of truth and justice continues long after the headlines fade and the courtrooms empty. Every unsolved case represents not just a failure of the system, but an opportunity to learn, improve, and ensure that future victims receive the justice that Edward Hall and Eleanor Mills were denied. Their story may have ended beneath that crabapple tree in 1922, but their legacy lives on in every advancement in criminal investigation and every effort to understand the dark corners of human behavior that produce such tragic outcomes.